Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from the land down under, the case of Gabe Meyer. He was a teenage boy who just mysteriously disappeared one day in January of 1993. When Gabe went missing, there were a couple of theories floating around in the beginning as to what might have happened to him. However, ultimately, it became pretty clear that foul play had been involved in his sudden disappearance, and a top suspect was quickly identified by the police. And I have to say that this killer's motive in particular is one of the most insane that I've ever heard in a true crime case. The reason that he carried out this horrific crime is just unbelievable and truly shows you just how deranged and quite honestly sociopathic this perpetrator was. Join me as we delve into the sadistic story of Gabe Meyer. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a big thank you to HelloFresh for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service that the regular viewers of my channel will know I have been using for literally years now. Every single week they offer a huge variety of delicious recipes which can be delivered straight to your door. All you have to do is pick the meals that you would like to try on their website and they will do the rest. They will send you the instructions and a box full of all of the ingredients that you will need. I've spoken briefly before about how one of my goals for 2024 is just to be a bit more mindful about my waste, whether that be, plastic waste or food waste. And with HelloFresh, they just put my mind at ease when it comes to food waste because all of the ingredients that they send you are pre-portioned. So if you're cooking for 2 people, they'll send you just the right amount of ingredients that you'll need for 2. If you're cooking for 4, they'll send you the right amount for 4. And that way, of course, no food gets thrown out. And I know that for a lot of people, a new year means new routines and trying to adapt new healthy habits. And I personally think that HelloFresh is perfect for staying on track with that kind of thing. As I said, they offer a variety of different meal options to suit different dietary requirements, including calorie smart options too. HelloFresh in general just makes cooking at home so much easier and so damn convenient. They save you so much time in the evenings, and for me, they actually make cooking a meal an enjoyable process rather than something that I dread doing at the end of a working day. And I feel like I've learned so much about cooking just from following their recipes. So if you would like to check out HelloFresh for yourself, then the link to their website will be at the top line of the description box. And for those of you who also live in the UK, if you use the code WEST6020, you will receive 60% off of your first box, 20% off of the next 2 months, and also some free little gifts sprinkled in there too. You're welcome. Thank you so much to HelloFresh once again for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to all of you guys watching for showing your support to the sponsors on this channel, and now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a teenage boy and it involves heavy themes such as harassment and mental and emotional abuse. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 31 years now to early 1993 in Innisfail, which is a town located in Queensland in northeastern Australia. And this is Gabriel Meyer, known as Gabe to his friends and family. He was a 17-year-old boy who lived in Innisfail. Gabe Meyer was born in 1976 to his parents Sherry and Doug Meyer, and he was one of 6 children, so he came from a big family, and he was the second oldest child. The oldest of the 6 was a girl named Fawn. She was a couple of years older than Gabe, and whilst Gabe was close to all of his siblings, he was said to be especially close to Fawn. They were described as honestly just being inseparable growing up. They clearly had a very, very strong bond. Now, the Meyer family used to actually live in Miami in Florida. That's where they were from. And Gabe's father, Doug, worked there as a boat builder, whilst I think his mother, Sherry, would look after their many kids. However, eventually Doug decided that he wanted to move his family elsewhere, mainly due to safety reasons. The crime rates in Florida at the time were very high nearby, and Doug and Sherry just didn't want to raise their kids there. They wanted to move somewhere that felt more safe and secure, and so ultimately they decided to relocate to Australia. Specifically, they obviously moved to the friendly and idyllic town of Innisfail in Australia. They bought a lovely house in a beautiful spot in Innisfail. It was right by the river, and they settled in very quickly. They seemed to be so happy there, and Doug Meyer described it as being, quote, a magical place. They thought that it was the perfect area for their children to grow up, and they moved to Innisfail about a year and a half before this case occurred. Sherry and Doug described their oldest son Gabe as just always being such a lovely young boy. He was so well liked by everyone that knew him, and he seemed to be the kind of boy that kept people on their toes. Sherry Meyer said that Gabe was the instigator of the family, so I think he was very adventurous and active and sporty. His mum said that Gabe kept life exciting for them, but equally he was also described as being a very mature and responsible young man, very dependable, which I can imagine is why panic quickly set in for Sherry and Doug Meyer when one day, completely out of the blue, Gabe went out, he left the house, and he never came back. He never returned home. The date was the 12th of January 1993. It was a Tuesday, and Gabe was actually off school at the time. It was the school holidays. And so that afternoon, Gabe asked his father Doug if he could please have a lift to the local gym that he went to. He wanted to get a workout session in, and of course Doug said yes, and so they got in the car. Doug drove Gabe to the gym, and he said goodbye to his son, expecting to see him again just a couple of hours later when he returned home. His parents expected him to return home for his dinner. However, it got to like 7:30, 8 o'clock that evening, and he hadn't. The family all sat down to eat their meal, and there was no sign of Gabe, which did concern Doug and Sherry. I mean, they tried not to panic too much initially because, you know, he was a 17-year-old boy. It wasn't like he was a little kid. He was at that age where he did have a bit more freedom and independence, and his parents thought, well, maybe he's just running to a friend. He's hanging out with friends and he's just lost track of time or something. And so they tried to just relax and get some sleep, but they were listening out throughout the night for Gabe to walk through the front door, and they kept checking his bed to see if he was in it, but he wasn't. And they just could not shake the feeling that something was wrong here, because yes, he was a teenage boy, he was 17 years old, but regardless, this was so unlike Gabe. As I mentioned before, he was a very responsible boy. He was not the type of teenager that would just go out for hours on end and not check in with his family, not give his parents a ring and let them know where he was. Gabe wasn't like that because he wouldn't have wanted his parents to worry about him, and so as the hours ticked by and he still hadn't returned home, that feeling of panic just increased and increased for Doug and Sherry. They started worrying that maybe he had gotten into an accident or something, maybe he had been hit by a car and had been taken away in an ambulance, and so they picked up the phone and they started calling local hospitals asking if a Gabe Meyer had been brought in, but nothing. No hospital had any record of him being admitted that evening. And so the following morning, as soon as the sun rose, Doug and Sherry's next port of call was to reach out to Gabe's friends to see if perhaps he was with any of them. Maybe he'd stayed at a friend's house overnight. And the first friend that they decided to speak to was a guy named Damon Kalanka. He was 26 years old, so a fair bit older than Gabe, but regardless, they were good friends because Damon actually used to date Gabe's older sister Fawn. They used to be a couple. Damon was very much into his health and fitness, and so he and Gabe used to be gym buddies. They would go to the gym and work out together. And in fact, on the afternoon of the 12th of January, when Doug dropped his son at the gym, Damon Kalanka was there when Gabe arrived. So the last time that Doug saw Gabe, he was with Damon. So they decided to get in touch with Damon first. So Doug got in his car and he drove to Damon's flat. And when he got there, he told Damon that Gabe obviously hadn't returned home from the gym the previous evening. And he asked Damon if he knew where Gabe was. Did he know where he'd gone after leaving the gym? And Damon basically said to Doug something along the lines of, oh yeah, after our gym session, Gabe actually came to mine for a bit. He He came to my flat and he was here for a short while before leaving. And Damon said that when Gabe left, he mentioned something about going to the pontoon down by the Johnston River for a swim, which Doug immediately thought was really strange, the fact that Gabe had gone swimming so late at night on his own. But regardless, he headed down to the pontoon anyway to check if his son was there, and he wasn't. There was no sign of him. And it was then when Doug just knew that it was time to contact the police and file a missing persons report. So the investigation into the disappearance of Gabe Meyer began, and it obviously started with the police trying to find out more about Gabe, what he was like, who his friends and family were, etc, etc. And there were a couple of different theories floating around in the beginning as to what might have happened to Gabe that the police had to investigate. So for example, there was the runaway theory. As with most cases of missing teens, the police have to look into the possibility that maybe they had chosen to disappear, maybe they had chosen to run away from home. Although I think very quickly that theory was basically ruled out in this particular case, because upon looking into Gabe's family and his home life, the police couldn't identify any reason as to why Gabe would have wanted to leave. As we know, he was from such a loving, tight-knit family. He got along well with his parents, he was close to all of his siblings, he had no reason to run away at all. And to further discredit this theory, the police found that there hadn't been any recent activity on Gabe's bank account. He hadn't withdrawn any money following his disappearance. And if he had run away, then you would have expected him to have taken some money with him to buy food and for accommodation and travel. Speaking of travel, there was also no evidence that he had used any form of public transport. The police got in contact with local transport services and companies to try and establish whether Gabe had maybe gotten a taxi or a bus somewhere, or maybe even an aeroplane. But again, there was nothing. They had no record of him. So there really seemed to be no evidence whatsoever to support the runaway theory. And so then came the theory that perhaps Gabe really had gotten into some kind of tragic accident. The police thought that maybe he had drowned because of the fact that the last person to see Gabe was Damon Kalanka, and he told Gabe's father Doug that when Gabe left his flat on the evening of the 12th, he said that he was going to go for a swim down by the Johnston River. So had something happened to him whilst he was swimming? Had he tragically drowned? Or had he perhaps been attacked and eaten by a crocodile? You see, the Johnston River in North Queensland is known to be swarming with crocodiles, and so for that reason, of course, it was very, very dangerous for people to swim in. And so the police really thought that maybe that is what happened here. Whilst Gabe was out swimming, he may have been killed by a crocodile for food. And so with this theory in mind, the police began searching along the riverbanks, because crocodiles are known to store and hide their food under mangroves and like water reeds along the riverbanks until they return to consume it later. So if Gabe had been attacked by a crocodile and he was sadly dead, the police thought that they'd probably find his body, or what was left of his body, tangled up in the water reeds. So they started searching along the river, but there was absolutely no trace of him. And not only was there no sign of his body, there was also no sign of any of his clothing or belongings that he had with him that day. So there really seemed to be no evidence to support the crocodile theory either. And as I mentioned briefly before, Gabe's father Doug and also his mother Sherry, they didn't really believe this theory anyway, because Gabe was not stupid. He knew the dangers of the Johnston River. He knew that there were crocodiles in it, and so therefore it was unsafe to swim in. And even if there weren't crocodiles in it, Gabe knew the dangers of the water in itself. He'd always grown up around water. You know, he lived in Florida, so he always loved going to the beach and going swimming and fishing and stuff. Obviously, his dad worked on boats, so he spent a lot of time with his father around water, so he was a very strong swimmer. And also his mother Sherry said that he was very respectful of the water, and he knew better than to go swimming in a river late at night on his own, let alone a crocodile infested river. And so for that reason, they just didn't really believe that Gabe would have done that. They didn't believe that he had gone swimming that night, as Damon Kalanka had told them. them. So then, what does that mean? Was that a lie? Was Damon Kalanka lying about Gabe having gone for a swim? And if so, why? Why would he lie about that? Well, the police soon theorised that perhaps he lied because he was actually somehow involved in Gabe's sudden disappearance. You see, it didn't take long for the police to become very suspicious of Damon Kalanka, not just because of the fact that he seemed to be the last person to see Gabe alive, but also because Damon Kalanka was a name that they had heard before. They were very familiar with him because of his involvement in an attempted murder. Yep, you heard me right, attempted murder. Just 2 years before this case took place, in 1991, Damon Kalanka was arrested after he tried to kill a young man named Paul Malik. Now, the circumstances which led to this crime basically revolved around an ex-girlfriend of Damon Kalanka's. He used to date this girl and she ended up leaving him. She split up with Damon, and following this, she got into a new relationship with Paul Malik, which Damon Kalanka was furious about. He was distraught at his girlfriend leaving him for someone else, and he just couldn't let it go. He was constantly trying to get her back, persuade her to get back together with him, but it wasn't working. She was refusing his advances. And so, one evening in 1991, Damon asked Paul Malik to meet with him. He wanted the two of them to just go for a drive together and discuss this whole situation and sort it out. And Malik agreed, and when that evening came, Damon Kalanka drove the two of them to this quiet, secluded area. He pulled the car over and they both got out of the vehicle, and whilst Paul Malik had his back turned on Kalanka, Kalanka saw this as his perfect opportunity to strike. He grabbed a knife, ran up to Paul Malik and plunged this knife into Malik's back. He literally stabbed him in the back. Now, luckily, during this, the knife actually slipped and the blade cut Damon Kalanka's hand, causing him to drop the weapon. And so Paul quickly picked the knife up off the ground and he just started running away from Damon Kalanka as quickly as he could. And Damon got back in his car and he started driving up behind Paul at a very fast speed. He was trying to hit Paul with his vehicle, but again, luckily, Paul managed to jump out of the way of the car just in time and he carried on running. And he ran to this nearby farmhouse for help. He began banging on the door, and when the owner of the house opened it, he begged them to call the police because this guy was trying to kill him. Thankfully, Paul Malik survived this terrifying attack, and Damon Kalanka was quickly arrested and charged with attempted murder. However, for some bizarre reason, the charge of attempted murder was actually dropped when the case went to court, and I have no idea why. I couldn't find any information online about why exactly it was dropped, but unbelievably it was, and instead he received a lesser charge of unlawful wounding and dangerous driving. And again, unbelievably, his punishment for this was 200 hours of community service. He had literally tried to kill someone and he got community service. No prison time at all, which is insane. And so that is the reason why when Gabe Meyer disappeared 2 years later in 1993, the police quickly became very suspicious of Damon Kalanka because they knew his history. Gabe Meyer vanished without a trace one day in January of 1993, and the last person to see him was a guy who had been arrested for attempted murder just a couple of years earlier. Of course, the police are going to be very skeptical. Of course, he's going to be a person of interest. So Damon Kalanka was asked to come down to the police station to give them his account of the day that Gabe disappeared, which we've basically already covered. They did a gym session together. Damon said that following this, Gabe came over to his flat where they chatted for a while. He said that he'd made Gabe this protein shake because, as I mentioned before, Damon was very much into his health and fitness, and he had apparently told Gabe about these protein shakes before, how they help to build you up, build up muscle, and so Gabe was really keen to try one. So yeah, he said that he'd made Gabe this protein shake, he drank it, and then around 5:30 p.m. that afternoon, Gabe left and he told Damon that he was going swimming. And Damon said that that was the last time that he saw Gabe. And in actual fact, this story did seem to be backed up by Kalanka's flatmates. He had two flatmates and they were in the flat that afternoon when Damon and Gabe were there after they returned from their gym session. And these flatmates confirmed to the police that, yeah, Gabe did leave at around 5:30 p.m. and they said that they themselves then left the flat about 15 minutes after this to go and watch a movie, leaving Damon Kalanka in the flat on his own. So despite the police's suspicions of Damon Kalanka, he did seem to have witnesses to confirm his account. So if he didn't have anything to do with Gabe's disappearance, then where was Gabe? What had in fact happened to him? A couple of days after Gabe vanished, his distraught parents, Doug and Sherry Meyer, appeared on TV, on the news, where they made a heartbreaking appeal for information regarding the disappearance of their son, which did result in the police receiving a number of tips and leads and even reported sightings of Gabe from all over Australia. However, unfortunately, it was just dead end after dead end. But then, I believe about a week or just under a week after Gabe vanished, the police received another tip, which would prove to be very significant in the case. They received a call from this teenage girl, and she said that she and her boyfriend had been down to the pontoon by the Johnston River at around 7:30 p.m. on the evening that Gabe disappeared. And whilst they were there, they did see some items just discarded on the side of the river. She said that there was a bag and some shoes and maybe a few other things as well. And without really thinking about it, she and her boyfriend for some reason decided to pick these items up and throw them into the water, into the river. Maybe they thought it was funny at the time or something, I don't know. However, I believe she said that it was afterwards when they later heard about Gabe's disappearance on the news, and it had been reported that he may have disappeared while swimming at the Johnston River, when she decided to call the police just in case those items that they had thrown into the water were in fact Gabe's. And so it was upon receiving this information when the police were just like, okay, we're going to have to thoroughly search the river then. Obviously, prior to this, like we discussed earlier, they'd only really searched along the riverbanks to see if Gabe's body had been stored under some water reeds or something by crocodiles. But now they decided that they were going to have to send dive teams in to properly search the water for Gabe's belongings potentially. Before the divers were sent in, the police set off these explosives in the river to scare off the crocodiles. And then once they did that, the dive teams went in, and within literally minutes, they found something. It was a watch, a wristwatch, and when this watch was shown to Gabe's parents, Doug and Sherry, they confirmed that it was their son's. It was Gabe's watch that had been recovered from the river. And that wasn't all that was found. Also recovered from the water, actually washed up near the water's edge, was some shoes and a knapsack. And again, these items were confirmed to be Gabe's. These were the belongings that he had with him on the day that he vanished, which I suppose seemed to suggest that he really had gotten into some kind of tragic accident in the river. He had drowned or been attacked by a crocodile. Well, not necessarily for the police actually. They still weren't convinced that that was the case. They still believed that something far more sinister may have happened to Gabe because of his watch. According to a documentary that I watched, Gabe's wristwatch wasn't just a normal watch, it was like a diver's watch, ironically, because, you know, he'd always spent a lot of time around water, so I guess it makes sense that he had this fancy kind of watch. And there were like 2 clips to fasten and undo this watch from your wrist. It was a double clip, so it would have sat on his wrist quite tightly. And so for that reason, the police just weren't convinced that the watch had just slipped off of his wrist during an accident in the river. To get this watch off, you would have had to have taken it off and undo it and everything. It more than likely wouldn't have just come off naturally, if you know what I mean. So had someone purposefully taken it off of Gabe's wrist and either thrown it in the water themselves or left it on the side of the pontoon with his other belongings before those teenagers later threw them in the water? And if that was the case, why had they done that? Why had they taken his watch off and left his belongings on the riverside? Was it a part of a cover-up attempt to make it look as though Gabe really had gone swimming and had drowned or been attacked by a crocodile when in fact he hadn't? Had someone tried to stage this scene? And if so, who? Well, the police still had their suspicions that it was Damon Kalanka. After all, he was the one who told the police and Gabe's family that he had gone swimming at the Johnston River, despite the fact that his roommates had essentially confirmed his story from the afternoon that Gabe went missing. He was still very much a top suspect. They still believed that he had something to do with Gabe's disappearance, possibly even murder. But if he did, then what was the motive? What reason would he have had to want Gabe dead? Well, it soon became clear that his motive probably had something to do with Fawn Meyer, Gabe's older sister and obviously Kalanka's ex-girlfriend. Just want to quickly mention that it's just started tipping it down with rain and it is very windy outside. I don't know if the mic will be picking that up, but if it is and you can hear that, I do apologise. But anyway, I mentioned briefly earlier that Fawn and Damon Kalanka were in a relationship for a little while. They met one day at the gym and eventually Damon Kalanka started striking up a conversation with Fawn whilst they were both in the gym. He would say hello, he would ask her how she was, how her day was going, he would pay her loads of compliments. It was very clear that he liked her, he fancied her, and Fawn seemed to like him back. She thought that he was really nice and charming, and so they started seeing each other. And when I say that they dated for a little while, I really do mean that it was for a very short amount of time. Their relationship only lasted for about 3 weeks because Fawn was headed off to America in 3 weeks. She had decided to go to a university in Miami in America, which is obviously where her family used to live before they moved over to Australia. She was going to be in America for her uni studies for about 3 years, and I think she decided that she didn't really want a long distance relationship during that time. That would just be too hard. So Kalanka knew that this relationship was not going to last. I think Fawn had made it clear that it was, you know, just going to be a short fling. But in that short amount of time, Kalanka met Fawn's family. He obviously met her younger brother Gabe and the rest of her siblings and her parents, and he actually became really close to the family. They liked him. They really liked Damon Kalanka. Doug and Sherry Meyer thought that he seemed very kind and polite and friendly. I mean, they did think that he was a bit intense sometimes. Like, it was very, very obvious right from the start that he was kind of overly smitten with Fawn, almost obsessed with her in a way, which, you know, for a relationship that had only just started and was going to be ending pretty quickly too, they did think was a bit odd. But yeah, regardless, like I said, he grew to be quite friendly with the family. He became good friends with Gabe in particular, and they would hang out and go to the gym together. And then came the time when Fawn went off to university. I believe this was shortly before Christmas in 1992, so just a couple of months, weeks even, before Gabe's disappearance. She was taken to the airport by her parents, and even Damon was there, and he was devastated. He was said to be very upset that Fawn was leaving, and her parents felt bad for him. They felt sorry for him, so much so that even after their daughter had gone, after she'd left, they tried to support him and be there for him as much as they could. They even invited him over for Christmas. They said that he could spend his Christmas with them if he wanted to, which he did. He did come over to their house on Christmas, which I think just further highlights how kind and genuine the whole Meyer family were. Let's be honest, they hardly really knew Damon Kalanka. He was just a guy that had dated their daughter for not even a month, and yet when his relationship with her ended, they were still so kind-hearted and generous towards him, and they probably assumed that he would get over his heartbreak and move on from Fawn soon enough. But as it would turn out, that wouldn't be the case. Damon Kalanka just could not let Fawn go. He wouldn't let her just get on with her new life in America. He would actually send her letters constantly. Almost every single day, she received a new letter from Damon Kalanka, sometimes even 2 letters a day. And in these letters, he would just tell her how much he loved her and how much he missed her. I have a quote here from one of the letters. He wrote, "I miss you so much, it's hurting me." And I just want to reiterate again that he was sending these letters to a girl that he had dated for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. He would also constantly beg her to come back. In the letters, he said that she should be in Australia. That's where she belonged with him. He even said that he would pay for her flight. And as you can imagine, Fawn just felt completely suffocated by Damon Kalanka. She was in a completely different country to him, and yet she felt like she was being smothered. But that wasn't all that Damon would write in the letters. He would also lie to Fawn, and he told her at one point that he had been diagnosed with cancer, throat cancer specifically, which, as I said, was not true at all. He was lying, but he clearly hoped that maybe that would convince Fawn to come back. Of course it didn't, but he was really trying to guilt trip her. This really was emotional and mental abuse that he was subjecting her to. She didn't want to be with Damon Kalanka anymore, and she had made that perfectly clear. She was just a 19-year-old girl who had her whole life ahead of her. She just started a new chapter in America, so she didn't want to be tied to him. But he could not accept that. He couldn't handle her rejection. He couldn't handle women rejecting him in general. I mean, look what happened with his ex-girlfriend before Fawn. She left him and began a new relationship with another man, Paul Malik, and he tried to kill Paul because he wanted her back. And of course, Fawn's parents, when they heard about all of this, you know, Damon sending her letters daily, pleading for her to come back, of course they were concerned. As much as they liked Damon Kalanka when they first met him and they felt sorry for him when Fawn left, they were just like, this is not okay. And they said to Fawn, you really need to essentially put your foot down now and tell Kalanka to stop with the letters and to stop trying to contact you. And so she did. She rang Damon Kalanka and she basically told him just that, to stop contacting her. She told him that America was where she lived now and that she was not coming back to Australia. She even said to him something along the lines of, the only reason I would come back now was if something was wrong with my family, if someone in my family was hurt or ill. And when the police heard about this comment that Fawn had made to Damon Kalanka about how she would only come home if something had happened to her family, they thought that it was very interesting, because not long after this phone call, all of a sudden, Fawn's younger brother Gabe went missing. And so I'm sure you know what's coming. The police theorized that Damon Kalanka decided to do something to Gabe, kidnap him, possibly even kill him, because he thought that that was the only way that he would get Fawn back to Australia. But the issue was they had no evidence to prove it, no solid evidence whatsoever to prove that Kalanka did something to Gabe. And so in order to hopefully find some, the police were really digging deeper into Kalanka's movements on the evening that Gabe disappeared. Now, Kalanka had told the police in his initial interview that sometime after Gabe left his flat to go swimming on the afternoon of the 12th of January, he went and hired a ute, which is a car in Australia, and he said that the reason he needed this car was because he needed to transport a carpet to the town of Tully in Queensland, Australia, which is just under a 40-minute drive away from Innisfail. He said that his sister lived in Tully and that he was giving this carpet to her, and so he went and hired a car. He put the carpet in the back of the car. He claimed that he then drove one of his neighbours to a local pub. They had asked him if he could give them a lift to and from the pub to cash a cheque, and he said yes, and so he gave them this lift. And then following this, Kalanka began driving to Tully. However, he never made it there. He said that he got about halfway and then it just started pouring it down with rain, and so he decided to just turn around and head back home because it wasn't great conditions to be out driving in, and also the carpet was in the back of the ute, like I said, so it didn't have a roof, it wasn't shielded from the rain, it was just exposed and it was getting wet. So yeah, he said that he just went home and he told the detectives that the carpet was currently in his garage. He still hadn't taken it to his sister's. So the police went and they seized this carpet, and to be honest, just because of how the carpet looked, the police weren't really buying this story at all, because he was kind of making out like he was giving his sister this carpet as a gift almost. He didn't want it anymore, so he was letting her have it for her house. But this carpet was quite filthy, to be honest. It was just old, so it wasn't in a good condition, and there were quite a lot of stains on it. And actually, the police did think on first glance of these stains that they may have been blood, and so they were examined closer and forensically tested, and ultimately it was determined that they weren't blood. But as well as that, his hire vehicle, the ute, was also seized. The police thought that if Kalanka had killed Gabe, then perhaps he'd used this car to transport his body somewhere. But again, to be honest, nothing was really found in the ute to support this theory either. Nothing was found which really linked him to Gabe, so again, no evidence there. However, although there was no evidence inside of the actual vehicle itself, the police did identify a potential discrepancy in Kalanka's story from that night via the mileage history of the actual car. So the mileage history stated that on the night of Gabe's disappearance, Kalanka had travelled about 119 kilometres. However, when the police did the exact same journey, travelled along the exact same routes that he said he had taken that night, so like his route to and from the pub to drop off his neighbour and his journey halfway to Tully and then back again, the police found that they had only travelled 61 kilometres, 58 kilometres less than him. So that indicated that he wasn't being truthful. He had travelled elsewhere that evening as well, somewhere that he hadn't told the police about, perhaps to a location to dispose of a body. But I mean, despite the fact that that was very suspicious, that in itself wasn't really evidence. It's not enough to prove Kalanka's guilt. Also, as part of their inquiries, Kalanka's flat was searched. They searched it for blood or any kind of evidence of a violent struggle, I suppose, but once again, there was nothing which indicated that that was the scene of a crime. So there was still nothing particularly incriminating against Damon Kalanka. However, during their investigation, the police were contacted by a friend of Kalanka's. His name was James Potter, and he contacted the detectives because he knew that Kalanka was a person of interest in Gabe's disappearance, and he had some information about Kalanka that he thought may have possibly been relevant to the case. James Potter explained to the police that about 2 weeks before Gabe vanished, Damon took him to a place called Polly Creek, which was like this bushland rainforest area near Innisfail, and he said that whilst they were there, Damon Kalanka walked them to this one particular spot in the bushland, and he said that Kalanka had marked it with these 2 sticks so that they were positioned like a cross, almost like X marks the spot. And he told James Potter at the time that he was doing that because he wanted to remember that spot. He wanted to be able to find it again the next time that he came to Polly Creek. And James Potter also told the police that not long after that, Damon asked Potter if he could borrow a shovel. So upon receiving this information, the police went to this area in Polly Creek, not really knowing what to expect, to be honest. When they arrived, they found the X marks the spot that Potter had told them about, and not far from that, they found this big mound of palm leaves, as if they had been placed in this one particular area to cover something. And underneath these palm leaves, the police found that there was a hole in the ground, a hole that seemed wide enough and long enough and deep enough to fit a human body inside of it. this looked like a grave. However, there was nothing or no one inside of it. It was empty. And actually, that wasn't the only grave-like hole that the police found at Polly Creek. There were actually 2 more beside it that were a little bit smaller and were again empty. And of course, the police believed that these holes, these graves, had been dug by Damon Kalanka, and so they confronted him about it. They brought him back to the police station and they asked him about Polly Creek. They asked him if it was him that had dug these grave-like holes there, and he actually said, yeah, that was me. However, he claimed that he had dug these holes because he planned to grow some marijuana in them, which he could then go on to sell. Although the detectives didn't really believe this either, because if you're gonna start growing marijuana, you don't need a hole as big as like 6 foot long and 2-3 foot deep like the hole he had dug. Like I said, the hole that he had dug literally looked like he intended for a body to go inside of it. Gabe's body, maybe. Maybe if he did kill Gabe, his intention initially was to bring his body to Polly Creek, but then for some reason he changed his mind and took him elsewhere. Also, in this interview, the detectives just asked him directly about whether he did kill Gabe. They said to him, you know, there's a rumor going around that you are responsible for his disappearance. What do you say to that? And he basically said that that rumor was false. He was innocent. He said that he loved the Meyer family and that he would never do anything to hurt anyone in it, including Gabe. And whilst the detectives still didn't believe that, they still believed that he was in fact involved in Gabe's disappearance, once again, they still didn't have the evidence to prove it. There were so many aspects of Damon Kalanka's story that just did not make sense, like the holes at Polly Creek, the carpet, the mileage history on his rent vehicle, his story about Gabe going swimming. None of it was adding up. But at the same time, that in itself was not enough to prove his guilt, so the police couldn't do anything. They couldn't arrest him for Gabe's disappearance and murder. I mean, they didn't even know if Gabe was definitely deceased. The police were getting increasingly desperate at this point. All other lines of inquiry just were not leading anywhere, and so they began thinking that maybe there was one person that might be able to get the truth out of Kalanka, and that was Gabe's older sister, Fawn Meyer. As we know, Fawn was in America for her uni studies, and the theory was that Kalanka had made Gabe disappear in the hopes that maybe that would encourage Fawn to come back home to Australia, and so the police asked Fawn for her help. They asked her if she would be comfortable with calling Damon Kalanka, and during this phone call asking him some questions regarding her brother's disappearance, just to see what he would say, and she agreed. Of course, she was also desperate to find out what had happened to Gabe. So the time came, Fawn rang him, she started talking about Gabe, and she didn't like outright accuse Kalanka of having done something to Gabe, I don't believe, but she said words to the effect of, I will not be coming home until I find out what happened to my brother, where he is. Because by this point, I think Kalanka was under 24-hour surveillance, and so the police were hopeful that if Fawn said that, it might prompt him to either reveal where Gabe was or move Gabe's body somewhere else, somewhere that he would definitely be found. However, as it would turn out, sadly, nothing came of this. He didn't admit to Fawn that he had abducted or killed Gabe, nor did he move Gabe's body to another location. So that was yet another dead end. And unfortunately, following all of this, Gabe's case actually started to go cold. It was just a nightmare for the police, and of course his family, because, I mean, everyone knew who was responsible. They just knew that it was Damon Kalanka, but they just did not have the concrete evidence to link him to the crime, and so it started looking like perhaps he was going to get away with this, and perhaps Gabe would never be found, or at least that was until about 2 weeks after Gabe vanished, when finally the police received the breakthrough that they so desperately needed when a tip came in from a member of the public. A woman named Margaret Carmichael called the police, and she lived in a kind of farmland area, I believe just outside of Innisfail, and she said that the previous evening she had been out for a walk around her house, and during this walk she just suddenly came across an absolutely foul smell. I have a quote here from from her call to the police, she said, "I smelled something on my walk last night and it does smell really bad. It does smell like a dead pig. I just hope it's a dead pig." And as soon as Margaret told the police more about this area where she lived, they became very, very interested in this one particular tip, because it turns out that her next door neighbours were Damon Kalanka's parents. He used to live in this area before he moved out and got his own flat, so he was very familiar with the location. He grew up there. And now, 2 weeks after Gabe's disappearance, the Kalanka's next door neighbour, Margaret Carmichael, has called the police, stating that she believed she could smell some kind of dead body, whether it be the body of a pig or something far more sinister. So the police immediately descended on this area. They started looking around and quickly they identified the spot that this smell was coming from. It was in this bushland area just off the track, and there was a spot on the ground that had been covered with a load of leaves and tree branches, and the police also noticed that there was a swarm of flies hovering around it. Clearly something or someone deceased was here. So they started carefully digging in this spot, and quickly, of course, they found a dead body, a dead human body. This was obviously the body of 17-year-old Gabe Meyer, and Gabe's family were informed that finally he had been found. Gabe's body had been wrapped up in a blanket which was secured with rope, and rope had also been used to tie his ankles and his wrists together, and his hands had actually been tied behind his back. Meanwhile, as his body was being uncovered, detectives started taking a statement from Margaret Carmichael, the one who had alerted them to this shallow grave near her house. And she actually told them that on the evening that Gabe vanished, on the night of the 12th of January, she recalled seeing a vehicle's headlights driving down a back road towards the area of the farmland where Gabe's body was later found. And of course, she didn't really think much of it at the time, but now it seemed as though that vehicle was probably being driven by Damon Kalanka, as he had just killed Gabe and was looking for a place to hide his body. And Margaret also told the detectives that just the day before she called the police about the foul smell near her house, she'd seen Damon Kalanka riding a bike very near to the area where Gabe was buried. And she now believed that he was there that day to further disguise the grave, because she had walked past the gravesite earlier that day, obviously not knowing at that point that a dead body was buried there. And then she also walked past the grave later on after she saw Damon there. And this second time that she walked past it, she noticed that it looked different. She noticed that a lot more leaves and tree branches had been placed over it. So clearly Damon Kalanka had done that. He'd returned to the gravesite in an attempt to further disguise it. So finally the police had recovered Gabe's body, and they were finally obtaining evidence which linked Damon Kalanka to his murder. They were starting to build a picture of what exactly had happened. But although it was now crystal clear that Gabe had been murdered by Damon Kalanka, on an initial look at his body, it wasn't at all clear to the detectives exactly how Gabe had been killed. They couldn't really see any areas of injury on his body whatsoever. So for example, there were no stab wounds or anything. There were no like strangulation marks or head injuries. They couldn't tell just from looking at his body how he had been killed. But of course, all would be revealed when his autopsy was performed. The medical examiner found that Gabe had a number of different drugs in his system at the time of his death. And it was determined that these kinds of drugs were most often found in cold and flu tablets. And there were very, very high levels of them in his system. He had so much that it was established that he would have fallen unconscious or maybe even died very shortly after taking them. Gabe had been drugged by Kalanka, and if you recall from earlier on in the video, in Kalanka's first interview with the police where he was talking them through his account on the day that Gabe went missing, he described described how before Gabe left his flat to go swimming, he had made him a protein shake. So now the police believed that Kalanka had drugged this protein shake. He probably crushed up a load of cold and flu tablets beforehand and he put them into this shake so that Gabe would have had no idea about what was inside of it, what he was consuming. And some further evidence which supported this theory came directly from the chemist in Innisfail that Kalanka had purchased this medication from. The police got in touch with all of the nearby chemist stores and one of them was able to show the police a receipt that Kalanka had signed himself after he purchased 2 packets of the cold and flu medication. And this receipt was dated the 6th of January 1993, about 6 days before Gabe vanished. And this date seemed to be very significant because it was found that the 6th of January was just the day after Fawn Meyer called Damon Kalanka on the phone while she was in Miami for her studies, and she told him once and for all that it was over. She told him to stop trying to contact her, stop sending her all of these letters, and if you remember, it was also during this phone call that she made a comment to Kalanka about how she would only come back to Australia if her family needed her, if something had happened to one of her family members. So obviously it was no coincidence that just the day following this, Kalanka went and brought the pills from the chemist. But thankfully, the evidence against Kalanka did not stop there. You see, following the discovery of Gabe's body, images of the blanket that his body was wrapped in were released to the public. And it was following this when Damon Kalanka's ex-wife, he had actually been married before, his ex-wife got in touch with the police and she told them that that blanket was hers. Well, hers and Kalanka's. She said that when they were married, they owned a blanket that literally looked identical to the one that Gabe's body had been wrapped in. And she said that after they separated, Kalanka kept this blanket. And in addition to that, Kalanka's flatmates were also able to tell the detectives that the rope that had been used to tie Gabe's wrist and his ankles was rope that they used to have in their kitchen. However, they said that bizarrely, following Gabe's disappearance, this rope was gone. It was nowhere to be found in the flat. So clearly, Kalanka had taken it and used it to tie up Gabe's body. But going back to the blanket a second, now when this blanket was examined and looked at very closely by scientists, they discovered a number of different fibres on it, which didn't actually come from the blanket itself. It wasn't the same kind of material. It was actually found that these fibres on the blanket matched up with the fibres from that roll of carpet in Kalanka's garage. The carpet that he claimed he intended to give to his sister. So what the police think happened is that after Gabe was killed, his body was obviously wrapped up in the blanket and then the carpet was wrapped around the blanket. It was then put in the back of his hire vehicle and taken to the area by Kalanka's parents' house where Gabe was buried. And that's probably why none of Gabe's DNA, like his fingerprints or blood or anything, were found in the vehicle, because he was wrapped up. And so it was following the discovery of all of this evidence when 26-year-old Damon Kalanka was finally arrested for the murder of 17-year-old Gabe Meyer. And it was actually after his arrest when Kalanka's sister, her name was Deborah, she confronted her brother about Gabe's murder. She wholeheartedly believed that Damon was responsible and she wanted him to admit that to her. She said to him, quote, "For once in your life, I want you to be a man and tell us the truth. The family needs to know." And Deborah told the police that following this, Damon cracked and he did admit it to her. He did admit to his sister that yes, okay, he killed Gabe. But he claimed to her that he only did it because Gabe had apparently tried to come onto him. He was essentially trying to use the gay panic defense. He was saying that Gabe came onto him, he he panicked and got angry, and in a fit of rage he killed him. But the only person that he, I suppose, allegedly told this story to was his sister Deborah. The police tried to ask him about it after Deborah told them about this, but he would not discuss it with the police. He made no mention to them of Gabe supposedly coming on to him, and that was what led to the murder. Of course, the police didn't believe this story anyway regardless, and from what I can gather, when it came to his court proceedings, Damon Kalanka and his defense team tried to argue that this was a case of manslaughter. He finally admitted that he was responsible for Gabe's death, but he claimed that he didn't intend to kill him. And so it was down to the prosecution to prove that that was a lie, to prove that this was in fact a premeditated murder, and they did have the evidence to prove it. I mean, they had the proof from the chemist receipt, which showed that Kalanka went and brought the cold and flu tablets just under a week before Gabe vanished, and after Fawn broke up with him. And obviously his motive for doing what he did to Gabe centered around Fawn, around somehow getting her back to Australia. He had clearly decided that in order to do that, to get her back, he was going to have to make one of her siblings disappear. And it has been theorized that perhaps he thought about targeting a different sibling initially because of the smaller graves that were found at Polly Creek. If you remember, there was one big grave that was found at Polly Creek, which would have been big enough to fit Gabe in, this tall 17-year-old boy. But there were a couple of smaller grave-like holes around it, so it's believed that maybe Kalanka thought about abducting and killing one of Fawn's youngest siblings rather than Gabe, and that these smaller graves were dug for them. I mean, the graves at Polly Creek are obviously evidence in itself to prove premeditation, because Kalanka took his friend James Potter to this area in Polly Creek about 2 weeks before Gabe vanished, and he marked out the spot where the graves were with 2 sticks. And we know that he also asked James Potter for a shovel, so that was proof that this murder was planned. And it was during Kalanka's trial when the prosecution pieced this case together for the jury. They presented to them their theorized version of events as to what truly happened on the day of Gabe Meyer's death. So on the afternoon of the 12th of January 1993, after Gabe and Damon had been to the gym, they obviously went back to Damon's flat together. Gabe stayed there for a little while just chatting to Damon and also his 2 flatmates, and then around 5:30 p.m. Gabe left the flat. We know that about 15 minutes after this, Kalanka's flatmates also left the flat to go and watch a movie, and the prosecution believed that very shortly after they left, for some reason, Gabe returned to Kalanka's flat. It's not known exactly why, I don't believe. Perhaps he had left something there or whatever, but when he did return, it's thought that that was when Damon Kalanka made Gabe that protein shake, and he crushed up a load of the cold and flu tablets and put them inside of the shake. Now, it's been theorized that perhaps initially Kalanka's plan was to take a very drowsy Gabe to the area in Polly Creek where he had dug those holes, and that he was going to kill him there. However, he had drugged him with so many of these tablets that Gabe didn't just become a bit drowsy, he completely passed out. They knocked him unconscious, and so it's thought that Kalanka decided to just kill him in the flat instead. Now, something that I haven't mentioned yet is that when Gabe's body was found, they actually discovered this tiny bit of plastic from a plastic bag stuck to his face, and so because of this, the police and the prosecution theorized that after the protein shake knocked Gabe unconscious, perhaps Kalanka placed a plastic bag around his head, which caused him to suffocate to death. After he was dead, Kalanka removed some of Gabe's belongings from his body, such as his shoes and his wristwatch and his knapsack. He tied up his wrists and ankles, wrapped the blanket around his body, which he secured with rope. He hired the ute vehicle, wrapped Gabe's body in the blanket up in the carpet from his garage. He put the roll of carpet containing Gabe's body into the back of the car later that evening, and it's believed that as he was doing this, just before he was about to get in the car and start driving away, that was when his neighbour asked him for a lift to and from the pub to cash a check. Kalanka agreed to give his neighbour a ride, however he told told his neighbour that he needed to go and do something first and that he'd be back shortly. And it's believed that that was when he went down to the pontoon by the Johnston River, where he discarded of Gabe's belongings. He threw his watch in the water and just left the rest of his belongings, like his shoes and his knapsack, on the side of the pontoon, obviously in the hopes that people would believe the swimming story. He then returned to his home, dropped his neighbour to the pub and back again, and his neighbour had no idea that the entire time that he was in the car with Damon Kalanka, that in the back of his ute there was a dead body. After giving his neighbour a lift, it's believed then Damon Kalanka drove out to the area where his parents lived, as he had decided to bury Gabe there instead. And I believe that the reason for this, the reason he decided to bury him here instead of at Polly Creek, was because to get to the spot in Polly Creek where he had already dug the graves, you would have to walk for quite a while because it was well into the forest. So he couldn't drive directly to the spot, hence why he initially planned to take Gabe there when he was just drowsy, because then Gabe would be able to walk there himself. However, now that Gabe was dead, he knew that he wouldn't be able to, carry or drag his body to the spot in Polly Creek. It was too far a walk. And so instead he drove to the bushland beside his parents' house. Once he arrived, he carried Gabe's body out of the vehicle and he just left him hidden in the bushland for a little while. He didn't bury him straight away. He actually headed back to his flat first for a short amount of time, and it's believed that he did that so that he would be home when his flatmates returned after they had been to the movies, so that it looked as though he had an alibi, if that makes sense. I mean, he was very clever. He really did think this whole plan through. Once his flatmates had gone to bed, he then left his flat again. He got back in his car and it was found that he went and brought a torch from a local service station, and then from here he returned to the bushland very late at night, and using the torch to see, he buried Gabe's body in a shallow grave. And then the next morning he just carried on with life as normal. He made up the fake story about Gabe having gone swimming, and he also lied through his teeth to both Gabe's parents and also the police. At the end of the trial in February of 1994, Damon Kalanka was of course found guilty of murder, and he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of just 13 years, which is insane really. That means that at the minimum he would only have to serve 13 years before he could apply for parole. And so of course his non-parole period would have come to an end around like 2006, 2007 time, and it was following this when Damon Kalanka applied for parole. He applied numerous times over the years and he was rejected every single time. And of course Gabe's family, his parents Doug and Sherry, were pleading with the parole board every single time to please not let their son's killer out of prison. They said that if they let him out, he would do it again. I mean, we know what happened with Paul Malek. He essentially got away with the attempted murder of Paul because the court system downgraded his charge, and he therefore only got community service for that. And that is, I guess, the reason why he was able to go on and kill Gabe. If the charge of attempted murder hadn't been dropped, he would have been in prison at the time of Gabe's murder. So his family were warning the parole board that the risk he posed to the public was far too great for them to even consider his release. Damon Kalanka applied for parole 5 times over the years in total, and very disappointingly, on his 5th try, he was successful. And according to reports, in early 2020, so just a couple of years ago, he was released from prison. In total, he served about 17 years for Gabe's murder. And I really cannot even begin to imagine how devastating this must have been for Gabe's family. It's one thing to lose a family member, lose a child in such a horrific and brutal way, but to then have to deal with the person responsible for that, responsible for taking your loved one away from you, being released back into the public, being a free man. I can't even begin to comprehend how distraught they must have been. From what I can gather, Damon Kalanka hasn't reoffended since being let out of prison, or at least I couldn't find any information online about him reoffending anyway. I don't know where he lives now, I don't know what he's doing, but I just hope to God that he is being kept a close eye on. Otherwise, I do agree with the family that there is every chance that he could do it again, kill someone or try to kill someone again, which is a terrifying thought. In the aftermath of Gabe's murder, his loving parents, Doug and Sherry, co-founded the Queensland Homicide Victim Support Group, an organisation which provides support and counselling to other families just like them who have also been affected by homicide. It helps families to cope with the trauma in the aftermath of losing a loved one in such a horrific way, which is just amazing. And I will leave a link to their website down below in the description box if you would like to learn more about them or possibly donate to help fund the incredible work that they do. And that is it for this case. That concludes the heartbreaking case of Gabe Meyer. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases, you name it. Again, you can let me know in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box too. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.